His other form is that of a clown. Whenever he has a violent mood swing, his brain goes down for a moment. Then, he turns into a clown. In his clown form, he thinks that everyone will turn into monsters to attack him, and he will embark on a fantasy monster fighting journey. His name is George and he has a very grumpy personality. In real life he makes his living as a clown in Anime City and his greatest interest is doing Sudoku puzzles. His father has disappeared by accident and his mother is a vegetable who has been hospitalized. His childhood friend, Anna, works as a nurse in the hospital. On this day, Anna is molested by a patient in the hospital. George instantly turns into a clown. He beats up the patient. To his surprise, the patient next door has a heart attack from the shock. Because they could not pay the medical bills, George's mother was moved to the corridor. While he was in distress, his childhood friend Mike found George. He says he has a great money-making proposition, but only if he uses George's only house as collateral. George, who had no money, had to take Mike's advice. A few days later, he received a voice from Mike. George arrives at his friend's company, but he learns that his friend was fired months ago. That's when a man in black appears. He takes George to a mysterious place. This entire room is littered with surveillance. Tom tells George that Mike has taken George's house as collateral to gamble and even now owes Tom over $8 million. George, as the guarantor, is responsible for paying this debt, but with his current salary, even if he worked 4 jobs a day and didn't eat or drink, he would still have to repay the debt in 30 years. It just so happens that there is now an opportunity for him to pay off the debt and even make money if he boards a ship and takes part in a game. George could only agree to his request. A few days later, George arrives on the ship. He found that there were many people like him here. Tom announced the rules of the game. The rules were simple. A cardboard version of rock, paper, scissors. Each person had 12 cards and 3 stars. For rock, paper, scissors, 2 players play against each other and the loser has to give the winner a star and the cards played are destroyed. The game lasts for hours and when the game is over, anyone with a card in their hand or less than 3 stars is eliminated. The consequences of elimination are severe. Cards and stars can be traded or exchanged if voluntarily and there are loans on board, but interest is calculated from 1 minute onwards. George was thinking about how to improve his win rate when Jerry came up to him. He told George that he had been on the boat many times and had won every time. Because there is a bug in this game. 2 people playing the same cards would draw the game and the cards would be pinned. But they didn't need to give each other stars, so they were guaranteed to be destroyed and have 3 stars. George looked at Jerry and he chose to believe it. The first game was a draw and the second game was still a draw. Just when George thought this would work, something unexpected happened. In the 7th game, Jerry won. Jerry scrambled to explain that he had accidentally put the cards in the wrong order. In the next game he told George to remove the stones and he would play the scissors himself so that he could return the star to George again. George then flashed his cards. Once again George chose to believe him, but then the accident happened again. Jerry gave a smug smile. Clearly, Jerry was a con man who specialized in conning newcomers. George passed out from excitement. When he woke up, George was surprised to see Mike. An angry George hit Mike. After Mike explained, George then realized that he was in the thieves' boat and now he had no choice but to work with Mike. They now had 2 stars and 5 cards and needed to find someone to work with who had only stars and no cards. Soon, they found Sam. Sam took a cautious look at their cards before agreeing to work together. But as soon as they were out the door, Sam ran and quickly pressed on a card he had stolen from George. Unfortunately, he lost again, and he lost another star. They caught Sam and beat him up. Sam cried and said he had parents and children who needed care, he couldn't die. Sam said there was something wrong with their cards. Normal people play their cards in a certain order to make sure they have every card left in their hand, but their cards are 4 cards, scissors and a cloth, which makes it hard for them to win. He begged George to give him a second chance. George listened and thought he had a point. Once he had played scissors and rock in the first 2 games, he would definitely play cloth in the 3rd. So he asked Sam to find someone with 9 cards left in his hand, and once that person had 7 cards left, they challenged him. Soon, the target man appeared. Philip had just played rock, paper and scissors and there was a good chance he would play cloth on the next hand. Sure enough, Philip lost a star and he turned around in anger and was about to leave. George called out to him and suggested that he play another game. Instead, Philip said he would play 3 more games. George deduced that Philip was playing according to balanced thinking, so he assumed that George had the same 3 cards in his hand. The first game George played scissors and lost, leaving rock and paper. Philip must have played 2 cloths in a row to guarantee at least 1 more game. But what he didn't know was that all 3 cards in George's hand were scissors. As expected, Philip did indeed play 2 games of cloth in a row. He now had 5 stars. While this was going on, Tom brought out a man who turned out to have thrown his cards down the toilet and flushed them away, but was found out. Tom decided to eliminate him early. It turns out that the consequence of elimination is death. Seeing this, they realized the seriousness of the situation. They started looking at the card counter. They found that they currently had the most card scissors left in the room. At this pace of consumption, the person with the stones in his hand was most likely to win at the end. They took out a loan to hire someone to help buy the stone cards. Now they just had to wait for the cloth to be consumed and they would win again. But then the unexpected happens again. The cloth that was supposed to be depleted was no longer depleted, but the scissors were. It turned out that someone else was hoarding the same cards as they were, but the cards they were hoarding were cloth. The stone cards they had hoarded were useless instead. The man who was hoarding cloth cards approached them and offered to play a game against them. Instead, George offered to bet 3 stars a game. They agreed because George deduced that they had an odd number of cards and could not consume them all in an internal draw. So he came to them to race, but they had an extra card, and there was a good chance that this card was cloth because George and the others had the most stones. Sure enough, George won again. This time they had 6 stars. The 3 men split up. George took all the other 2's cards and learned what was left of their boss's cards. George threatened to give the boss $100,000 and he could take his cards or he would tell the whole room what he had. The boss had to give in and agree to George's request. Now that their most threatening opponent was no longer a danger to them, the scales of victory once again tipped in George's favor. But then Jerry came along again. He wanted to trade George a star for 5 cards or he would not be able to use up his cards. But George, whom he had tricked, refused his request. Angry, Jerry told everyone that someone had hoarded cards and that their hand was already known to others. He suggests that everyone reshuffle their cards to prove that they have become lambs to the slaughter. Jerry reveals the only cards left in the deck for several people. The crowd had no choice but to enter the tournament. Jerry also advised them not to play against those who hadn't participated in the shuffle, as they would be more likely to win with more cards. George had no choice but to take part in the shuffle, and after being cheated a few times, George got wise. He took a closer look at Jerry's shuffling technique. He found out that Jerry was cheating again. He kept the rock cards for himself, marked the scissors cards and dealt them to his target, and then left all the cloth cards for George. George unraveled Jerry's plot. At this moment, everyone refused to play against Jerry. In order to reassure the others to play with himself, George decided to put 3 cards in rock, paper, scissors each game and let his opponents decide which card to play. Except for Jerry. After everyone's cards had been depleted, George found Jerry. Now he was the only one with cards and you could only play against me. And it would take 5 stars a round or you would have to wait for elimination. Jerry had no choice but to agree. George made Jerry keep beating himself in order to get his revenge, and he didn't shout to stop even when Jerry was bleeding out. Finally, 1 second before the game ended, George played his card, but as George did not consume all the cards in his hand, he was put in the punishment room by the security guard. But he was sure that Mike would redeem himself out with the extra star. In the punishment room, Tom told George that you had brought nothing in and surely no one would ransom you out, because in the animal world there is only profit and no credit. George didn't believe him. At that moment, Mike was about to redeem him with the extra star. Sam grabbed the stars and persuaded Mike to give up on George because the 3 stars would be worth $1, $5 million if they were sold. In the end, Mike gave up on redeeming George. George looked desperately at what was happening in front of him and he angrily wrestled with Tom. When Tom got out, his accomplice asked him where his stuff was. Only then did he realize that the gauze was missing from Tom's back. For George deduced that according to Tom's theory he must have had over $1, $5 million worth of stuff on him, and the only place he could have hidden it was in the gauze on his back. Sure enough, the gauze was full of diamonds. Tom's accomplices had to ransom George again. As he was going out, an old man knelt down in front of George hoping that he would call his son for him. George ignored him. When he came out, George beat Sam and got back the money and the star. He did not take the star for the money, but redeemed the old man.
你还是当面跟你儿子讲比较好。我8岁时父亲就不在了，所以我能理解你儿子现在的感受。他现在需要的不一定是进口药，但他一定需要你陪在他身边。
In the end, George got off the boat without incident and lived a sweet life with Anna.